Come on in, everybody. Take a seat. We're going to get started in just a moment. All right, can we close the doors in the back? All right, good afternoon, everybody. Shana Tova again. We are really honored to be here with such a loyal group of Yom Kippur all-dayers. It's nice to see you all. The ones that are not yogis, right? Anyways, I'm really honored to be here with Beverly Tsacoyianis, who is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Memphis. A little bit about her. She completed her PhD at Washington University in St. Louis and has been teaching undergrad and graduate courses in world history, Middle Eastern history, and Islamic history at University of Memphis for 12 years. Her first book, published in 2021 by the University of Notre Dame Press, about mental health treatment in modern Syria and Lebanon, won a Choice Outstanding Academic Title Award. And she's currently co-editing a volume on disability history in modern Middle East at the moment. And so we are really lucky to have you. Beverly is both a scholar, an expert, and also a member of Temple. And so special to have you here, talking about, overarching about Israel, but more specifically, the American Jewish experience in this post-October 7th world that we're living in relation to Israel, right? We are not speaking about what it means to be Israeli during this time, what it means to be in Israel during this time, but the goal of this conversation is a little bit to bring the relevance to us personally a little more in terms of our experience living in America and living in Memphis during this time as Jews and navigating what this new world looks like for us. So we are going to dive in. We will save time for some questions at the end. If anybody has any additional questions to ask or directions that we may have time to go in. So we will get there. But first, I want to talk about where you spend your time, which is campus life. And it has been no secret that what has been incredibly newsworthy over the past year, beyond a year, has been the experience of being Jewish on a college campus in America has been, right? There has been no shortage of stories. There's been no shortage of lived experiences. Both, of course, we hear so much about the negative, but also there's some really positive ones. But what we hear about is the hard ones. And so let's dive into that a little bit while recognizing that the University of Memphis has a smaller Jewish population than some other schools, which I think makes it harder, right? So can you share with us a little bit about what you're noticing regarding discourse on Israel on campus from October 7th until now?
So first, thank you for inviting me. I teach modern Middle Eastern history classes, including the Arab-Israeli conflict class. And I teach that every couple of years. I think I've taught it 3 times at the University of Memphis. I think since October 7th, what I was seeing on campus was actually a little different than what I was seeing in my classes, which was that there were student groups that had popped up on campus that were very anti-Israel, and they were not interested in hearing from me. And I did get involved with a group off campus that fashioned itself on Facing History approaches, but they were not approved by Facing History for the way they were doing this. But when I spoke at that event, and I was part of it was last summer, not this past one, but the one before, and I looked at some of the feedback. One of them said that I was pretending to be an expert when actually I'm a Zionist. And I was like, bitch, I have a PhD. But also, but I didn't say it to her. It was inside head voice. But yeah, I do support the existence of the State of Israel. And I think that was a non-starter for some of the people in the community, in the Memphis community writ large, but also on campus. And so I was on purpose excluded from an event that, I don't know how many of you know Brian Quoba in the history department. He's not an expert on the Middle East, but he and Cookie Woolner, who is Jewish, but she's an anti-Zionist, they set up a panel with Michael Perez, who's an expert on Gaza. He does have training. He's an anthropologist. But they knew, because of my politics, that they didn't want me on the panel. So it was not sponsored by the history department, but Brian went around to 10 different departments and programs. He's director of African and African American Studies, so he sponsored it through himself for that. But he went to all these groups, and I emailed the chairs of each of those programs when I found out what was going on, because at the time, my friend and colleague, Dr. Dan Unowski, was chair, but he was on leave, so Sarah Potter was assistant chair, but she's also Jewish, and she was sending me the emails that were going back and forth from Cookie and Brian where they didn't want me on the panel, and she was like, I just want you to know what's going on. And I mean, I was furious, but we ended up having a faculty debate about it, and the way the department kind of went was that if you were going to present a panel and make it look like the historians are involved, you have to have the historians who are experts on that field. Anyways, but
so it tends to be, or what your experience has been, and again, this is one campus in one part of the country, right? We can imagine that these experiences, and we know these experiences are multiplied by hundreds across the country, that it's the inability to separate one's expertise from their identity as a Zionist, right? And that identity as a Zionist gives the automatic, right, no to any sort of engagement, regardless of what the actual expertise is that is incredibly relevant to the conversation. What have you seen in terms of students' responses, students in your class, and how do they bring this war into class with them, and what does that look like for you, and what's the response of their peers?
So this last spring semester that just ended was the first time that I had taught the Arab-Israeli conflict class online. Before, I had refused because I had felt that people needed to be in the same room looking at each other when they were talking about what was going on. But this time, I actually was relieved because these schedules are public, and I was worried that somebody would stand in front of our building and be aggressive or intimidating to the students. So, but the exciting thing for the way online courses at the University of Memphis work is that they're asynchronous. So I had students in there. It was a combined undergraduate-graduate course, so I had students in the graduate level who were teachers in high schools in California and New York, and it was fantastic. I also required that everybody in the introductions board post either an audio or a video post where they just say like, hi, my name's blah, 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 I'm in this time zone. And I think that really helps with online classes for engaging because you can actually see who's your classmate. But the students, there were a handful of students in that class who were very publicly like, I support a two-state solution. And then there were other students who were less interested in one side or the other, but they were all very respectful. And I think part of it is because of the way I set up the syllabus is that you have, a behavior plan and a code of conduct that the university has. And if I suspect there's anything going on the discussion boards that's inappropriate, and I tell them this at the very beginning. And some of those students have followed me with other courses, like my Modern Middle East class, my World Since 1945 class. I also have stuff on Israel and Palestine, so I'll put a few things in there because I teach those more often than the Arab-Israeli class. But the students were surprisingly,
You think some of that had to do with setting it up in a way that emphasized this is a hard topic. The priority is that we are all you are students learning. We are all here to learn, right? This is an academic course. This is a university or graduate level course. Let's treat each other as humans as we are diving into a topic that's incredibly difficult.
Yeah, and I think what also helped is that my background is in modern Middle Eastern history, but I focus on history of medicine and trauma studies and disability studies. So when I come into the class, I tell students a bit about myself, and I put things into I'm very intentional to warn them if there's something that will come up. Like there was a really good documentary on PBS Frontline that I included about Gaza, and I put things above where I had embedded the film, and I told them exactly which timestamps you would see like a little boy crying over his younger brother's dead body, like maybe jump over that if you want to, but students were willing to come at it the way we try to train history majors and non-majors is look at the primary sources, whether it's the documentary or the Balfour Declaration or something, and work with what you see and think about why it's there. Like what was the reasoning behind filming it this way? Why were the interviews chosen this way? So I think for them, because I come at it analytically, I'm not pushing them to have a specific, they know how I feel about Netanyahu, but I tell them within the context of the class of what he's done in Israel, and I sometimes draw parallels with certain American politicians, but I focus on the data, and then they can have their own conclusions, and I don't push them to, and it's illegal for me to push them to have a position on.
Of course. I want to switch gears here for just a moment. A big piece of this is what it looks like for American Jews to be talking about Israel with the overlay of our American political system at the same time. What challenges arise as we are grappling with both our American identities, our Jewish identities, our American politics, our Israeli politics, right? Like, what challenges arise when we try to discuss Israel in light of our role as American Jews?
Yeah, so definitely I think what's happening now, because of the administration that's in charge, there's a very limited space of the freedom to speak in general. The current president is not interested in like a free press. And so it's really, for me, I also feel a level of censorship within my own profession because I support Israel's right to exist. I think I'm kind of in the minority in the Middle East Studies Association. But, I don't post on Facebook about anything that's going on anywhere, like whether it's Israel or, Charlie Kirk or something could get fired. But I think it's hard for people. I think also American Jews obviously are a very diverse population, but I think there's a stereotype that you have to support every little thing that's going on in Israel rather than it's okay to critique. Like it doesn't make you un-American to critique something that happened in American history. And so it doesn't make you like not a Zionist to say that there were some missteps. Maybe there's some, issues with specific military campaigns, but you can still, I think some American Jews might have trouble distinguishing some of that, or they don't feel safe talking about it with somebody. I mean, when I did my junior year, so I went to Brandeis for undergrad, and I did my junior year at Ben Gurion University, and there was an American at BGU I remember her saying, like, don't forget whose side you're on. And I was like, well, I mean, I'm talking about, like, humanitarian issues. We weren't even talking about the right for Israel to exist, but it's like the idea that there has to be a side and that one side is homogenous is really very much stifling the freedom to speak and to kind of engage with people from different positions.
Okay, so with that, let's dive in a little bit deeper into the experience as American Jews, right? You also have an expertise in trauma studies, correct? So from a trauma studies perspective, knowing that October 7th was not only deeply traumatic for those that were there, that experienced it, but in a different way, was deeply traumatic for Jews around the world. And how has that played out? How has October 7th functioned as a collective trauma? And what does that mean for American Jewish communities?
Yeah, so I think there are kind of several layers of what traumatized all of us. And I think some of it is obviously the gruesome murders by the terrorists, but it's also, for me, one of the things that hurt was the silence from my own neighbors who were not Jews. And there was one person in my department who's not Jewish who practically like whispered to me like a couple weeks after October 7th that he felt was awful, but it was like in the hallway where no one else could hear, and like it was not Brian Quoba. But I think it says, so there's a book that's co-authored by Bashir and Amos Goldberg that's about the Holocaust and the Nakba, like how Arabs talk about, or the word in Arabic for the catastrophe that they had in 1947 and 48. But it's the book is co-authored, and it's an edited volume with multiple authors contributing. But there's the section after the title, it's colon, is a new grammar of trauma and history. And so I think one of the things that's going on in trauma studies is that people don't just talk about intergenerational trauma, but they talk about what shows up in that book is empathic unsettlement. So it's the idea that you are going to attempt to understand what another community is going through, and it is inherently unsettling because it's not something we're used to. But I think sometimes people on many different sides feel that if you start to have empathy with another community, that it's a slippery slope and you're going to lose your own kind of sense of the politics of identity within your own group. But you can have empathy for another group, and that does not dictate some trajectory that must end with a specific political kind of change. So like you can say to somebody like in Memphis, like, lynching was wrong, I'm against slavery and racism. That doesn't necessarily mean, okay, I'm going to give $1 million to this community, like in terms of reparation. There's a big jump between empathy and what to do in terms of the 4 R's, like restoration, kind of recognition that there was a traumatic incident. So I think for our community, it was several layers of, it's sort of like vicarious trauma because you saw it from afar, but you probably know a handful of people. The guy I dated for like a year when I was at BGU, his relatives were in one of the kibbutzes. And so, I mean, it feels closer than any other, kind of thing going on around the world.
Right. What I think many of us experienced, I'll speak for myself here, is that I am very clear of my identity that I'm not Israeli, right? And nor do I want to pretend to have the experience that, this is just speaking for myself, to have the experience that Israelis living in Israel, living on one of those kibbutzim, or who had an immediate family member who was at the Nova Festival, or was, in those settings myself, that's not my experience. But I'm also not entirely devoid of any sort of connection And it's not just an event that I thought was horrible and tragic and frightening and all the verbs all the adjectives we could use to describe it. So it's somewhere in between.
Yeah,
right?
and I think also, so just numbers-wise in terms of the proportions, and this is something President Biden had said, I think it was October 18th of 2023, when he was in Tel Aviv, and he talked about how it was sort of like 15 9/11s. If you think about about 10 million people living in Israel, 1,200 and massacred, and then 250 hostages, many of whom died. I mean, I think there's this level of profound violation that is different from the Holocaust, for example, because there was no state of Israel then. But now we're talking about a state that should have seen this coming. Like, one of the things I'm proud of is that Israel is so sophisticated in terms of its military intelligence. And to have had this level of a breach at the same time that was coordinated regionally because of the Houthis in Yemen striking at the same time and Hezbollah striking from Lebanon at the same time. It's not just Gaza. It was this whole regional thing that the Mossad and others should have seen coming. And so to have that level at the same time that Netanyahu was already, embroiled in all of the corruption issues with trying to take over the judiciary. I mean, it's like, there was a sense for me that the government of Israel failed its citizens. And that's very different from the Holocaust because there was no Israel. So I think in that sense, our level of trauma is coming from this place where we thought we were safe. And it's not just that the Israelis weren't safe, but here, like the level of anti-Semitism that increased. It's hard for me to tell my kids like what's going on, and I'm really glad to shout out Sarah first, but I'm glad that she's doing things like getting parents together to combat anti-Semitism here, because there were incidents in Memphis. I can think of one specifically where a little kid's Gaga ball said F Jews on it. This was like within the last year. So I think there is this sense that now that we know we're not as safe as we thought we were, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, and that's both, right, stemming from the event of October 7th itself and then the aftermath, right? You alluded a little bit to the rest of the Middle East, right? Can you share a little bit with us about that this is not just, it wasn't just an isolated tragedy, but there's a lot more going on. Can you share a little bit of context and what you have about that?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that makes the Middle East so fascinating to me is that it's such a hot mess, like in terms of what's going on. And so like the fact that the Houthis had the military technology thanks to the Iranian government, but that they're taking advantage of a decades-long civil war in Yemen, that because Yemen's a mess, it was easier for Houthis to attack. Because Hezbollah is like its own little mini state in Lebanon, they have, again, with the Iranians, like the military technology. So what's happening is that because there are a number of states in the Middle East that are dealing with their own kind of tragedies, like the Lebanese civil war and being under kind of Syrian and Israeli occupation for a while after the end of the civil war, like there's so many places that are unsettled, and it's really a chance for different militias, really, and guerrilla groups or like pseudo armies like ISIS, which real armies, but not for a state. But they take advantage of that vacuum or that mess of power at the top. And so I think that was a big part of it, that the Iranians, and obviously, we're talking like Hezbollah and Hamas both want to annihilate Israel, but they're different. They have entirely different kind of senses of how to practice Islam among themselves. And so there's no real like single vision in the Middle East or anywhere in the Islamic world to have on how to practice, how to be a good Muslim. And so there's all of this kind of backdrop of conflict just between Muslims in Yemen and Muslims and Christians in Lebanon. And there's just, Israel's so small, it's a really good distraction from having to deal with what's going on in other countries to push it all on Israel and make it the scapegoat. And like, it's not the Israelis' fault. what happened in certain areas of Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War. It's some Lebanese that were involved, but they have their own amnesty that they put through legislation. So there's a lot of like festering wounds in Lebanon, and with Yemen's civil war. There's just a lot of different parts of the Middle East that are struggling with their own ways of how to be a country that is properly protecting its own citizens. And there's also like a lot of refugees in these different groups, so it's a lot of moving pieces that I think, particularly on college campuses or on campus at the University of Memphis, when I would see students talking about Free Palestine or something, they had none of the background about what was going on regionally. But the ones that end up in my classes were not the same demographic. So even though there was some interest in learning more about Palestinians, it came from a place of like, I want to know more about the context, like kind of regionally.
Kind of diving into that a little bit, I'm curious, those students that are, we'll call them the Free Palestine students, right? That you just spoke about. What is their context, right? What is their understanding, and what is it in relation to the realities?
Yeah, so they have just I've spoken to a few of them and gotten a sense of what they think happened in history, and it's just very skewed and usually factually inaccurate, but it's
with the context that not every single student is the same.
Right, no, yeah. But I mean, just for example, from my own department, so like because Brian Quoba has a PhD in history, students think that he knows what he's talking about. But he's not an expert on that region. Like, I won't go out there and give you all the intricacies of Guatemala. Like, I barely have a couple paragraphs in it in the books that I teach from. So I would let somebody who's an expert on Guatemala, or at least, Central America, be on a panel about that. But Quoba's approach Sarah first attended this, so she was texting me, because I had, that was the same night for my Arab-Israeli conflict class that I was interviewing Judge Sherry Lippman, and that went much better than what you had to deal with. But Judge Lippman was talking about like the Israeli judiciary and the American judicial system and like the changes and differences, and my students loved that. But for Quoba, he put up this map that was like trying to parallel the experiences of various indigenous communities in the United States with Palestinians in the late Ottoman Empire, which he knows nothing about. But like, because he has a PhD in history, students, it's very dangerous. And this is something that I wanted to point out was such an irony that the people in my department who put that panel together framed it as how to talk about Palestine in the era of Trump. And their point was that Trump doesn't want, sophisticated, educated expertise. And they go and keep me off the panel. And I'm like, you're doing the same thing. But yeah, so I think the students that talk about freeing Palestine that I've met just either have no knowledge or no empathy. And that's really dangerous, because they're not interested in understanding why there was a branch of political Zionism, because it wasn't all Zionists, but why there was this branch of political Zionism in the 1890s that went all the way through the Holocaust, and why that becomes this backdrop, this trauma that puts a lot of Jews around the world on edge, and like, we need a place to be safe. So students who think about freeing Palestine often, not always, but they often are anti-Zionist, because they're not interested in Israel existing at all. And for me, that's really dangerous, because I think, and I've taught this in my classes, my World Since 1945 class especially, because there's cases all over the world about this, when you have a single state of different communities that see themselves as separate nations, and you try to make it a single state, what often happens is ethnic cleansing. So one nation will try to destroy the other nation. And it's happened in lots of places. You only rarely get something like Belgium, where they're like, it's fine. We can just be different. You speak Flemish, I speak whatever. It's like, but here, that's not like people who support, and there are more and more Israelis who are supporting a one-state solution. But if you support a one-state solution, and I've tried to tell students this, if you support a one-state solution in a place like Israel and Palestine right now, with the way things are between the different groups, that is a recipe for ethnic cleansing. Like, there's no way around it right now. If, 100 years from now, you end up with communities that are interested in coexisting peacefully, then I could see a one-state solution possibly being a realistic kind of end goal. But I think for now, a two-state solution makes a lot more sense in terms of safety for the different communities.
That diving into a conversation about one state, two state is a direction that we need much, much more time for. So I want to pull us back to the trauma piece for a second, and kind of two parts, thinking about past, present, and future. What has the past taught us about what we're experiencing now? And how do you think this moment will shape the trajectory of the young Jews today and future generations?
So I think what's happened often in the past with big traumatic moments is that communities look inward and they try to find some ways to grow in a safe space for themselves. So like building up, a Hillel or something. For me, I think the direction for the younger people now in this country is that there's a big kind of rift between affiliated and unaffiliated Jews. And I think in places like Memphis where like there's a lot of people are affiliated with some religious group, it's kind of your lifeline to become affiliated. But where I grew up in New York City, like you could just kind of, throw, piece of candy and hit somebody who's also unaffiliated. So it was really like the world in New York is just so different also because there's just a higher percentage of people with Jewish backgrounds. But I think what we've had in the past, with the Holocaust or with pogroms, is that the community looked in on itself, tried to protect itself. And, with Israel, it had this opportunity to do so much more on a global stage. But I think also for now, because we're such a small minority, I think for us to kind of continue, it's worth, and this is easy to convince a reform population, but it's worth recognizing that interfaith families should be, included and should be, that's an opportunity for us to be much larger than we are. I grew up actually in a mixed family, interfaith, Catholic and Jewish, but by the time I was in college, I was focused on conservative egalitarian, and I did come back to the Temple this year. I was here when I first moved here, but I think whether people are affiliated or unaffiliated, I think it's important to find people that you can feel safe around. And it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody that looks like you, like what Rabbi Micah was talking about yesterday. Like we should get out of our bubbles and reach, people that we're not used to interacting with. And you'll be surprised maybe, but there's actually a lot in common. And you can maybe not start with talking about Israel, but you can talk about other things. And there is a group here, the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, that was a branch of, there's branches all over the country. It did go on pause after October 7th because people just were in too much pain to try and hear each other. But I think one thing that will make us stronger is to reach out to each other. And we don't have to agree with each other about, even just in this room, there's probably like 200 different ideas of what should be happening in Israel, or in the U.S. But I think what the past has shown us is that the community looks in and can try and get stronger. But there are opportunities in looking beyond that and trying to build those bridges, especially in terms of allyship. Like if it's us against everybody, it's not enough of us. But if we have enough Gentiles or whatever who are aware that our community has something positive to contribute to society and we deserve to be here and we deserve to be safe, I think that's a good place to start.
So in a way, it's kind of the combination of, we're used to looking inward, and that's important, and only looking inward can get us in trouble. And that's not where we want to stay, especially when there's something that is so near and dear to our hearts that has to get out there in order for people to show support, to learn, to be allies, and to make sure that what we are experiencing anti-Semitism-wise in America today isn't the reality for years and years to come. I have something I want to end on, but we have time for questions. Rabbi Micah, do you mind helping with the questions? Yeah, thank you.
What an amazing panel, isn't it? Are you ready for questions? Okay.
Go ahead. Chef Fargenstein, how you doing? So I was October 7th, actually October 8th, sort of blew everybody's mind because there were so many liberal kids in America who immediately took the side of Hamas, which probably wasn't surprising. I started the Memphis Friends of Israel 25 years ago. We brought speakers to Rhodes, University of Memphis. We would have protesters out there, but this took it to another level. Do you think the hundreds of millions of dollars that Muslim oil money has poured into the academic community across the United States has impacted our young people? They're building Mideast studies, buildings. I was on the board of the University of Kansas for 6 years, and they were given $10, $15 million a year. So that's for the last 30, 40 years. Do you think there needs to be a change at the college level on accepting Muslim money?
Well, so that's a great question. So the first place that actually popped into my head is in England, at the Sultan Qaboos Center at Oxford. But also, the origins of Middle Eastern studies in the U.S. is very closely tied to the intelligence community and the Department of Defense and funding from those groups to build Middle East centers all over the United States and different universities. There are some countries that are interested in buying their way in, but it's not nearly as kind of widespread as some people might think. So there are, for example, the Saudi Arabian government pushed this kind of art scene thing a couple years ago, including here at the University of Memphis, and I got a free flight to Riyadh out of it. But it's just, I still spoke at a conference that happened at the University of Memphis afterwards about the way the Saudi money was meant to distract from their own human rights abuses. And so I think most of the American Middle East centers that are built up at the top universities today actually have their origins and their funding coming from the U.S. Department of Defense. Was there a specific university you were thinking of? Do you know which country the money was coming from? Yeah, so Qatar does this, but it's not, they're not interested in promoting Hamas. What's your PhD in? Is it? Anyway, but seriously though, I think there are funding groups in the Middle East that are interested in skewing the narrative, but it's really the place for academics to bring in the expertise that we have. And so I'm sure the University of Kansas has actual PhDs teaching at that center. And so it is, you can ask where money is coming from, but I think the most important thing is what is coming out of it. Like, what are the publications? What's being taught in the classes? And so, the fact that, the Department of Defense and, the National Security Education Program with the Boren Fellowship, the fact that that money was paying for people, like I got a Boren Fellowship that I turned down instead of, so that I could use money from the Department of Education when I was in Syria before the Civil War. But I think just because the money is coming from somewhere, it does not necessarily direct the agenda of the publisher or the academic that's seeking to be published. So I think what's important is to make sure that the research is solid, so that you're going through a peer review process at a reputable, publisher, an academic publisher. And so, yeah, I think that's the main kind of point there.
Other questions?
I'm always partial to people in the back.
Please, can you help me in how I feel about what is happening now in Gaza and Israel? I think of us as a compassionate people. The killing that's going on in Gaza now, help me to support what has happened, Israel, in this place that they're in with all the killing in Gaza.
Well, I don't support senseless violence. I don't support killing innocent civilians. But I don't think that. I think you can hold both ideas in your heart and not be a hypocrite. You can say famine is wrong. You should, the Israeli government should have allowed, or should be allowing now, international media to see what's happening in Gaza, because for quite a while they've been not allowing journalists in. But that doesn't mean you're against the existence of Israel. It just means we need to kind of, as Americans, we could try and put pressure on our leaders to try and affect change. But Netanyahu's not going to listen to anybody. That's just not his style. So it's really an issue of like, what can we do from here? But it's not anti-Israel to say that it's wrong to kill civilians. I do think Hamas should be removed from the political scene, but there are a lot of groups ready in the wings that are just as extreme, like the group Islamic Jihad. And so there's not really anything, I would support eliminating threats to Israel's safety, but I don't think that that's the same thing as, bombing an entire city. So I think you can be against famine and still be for the existence of Israel.
Other questions?
Do you mind if I go to the back? We'll come up, I promise. I'm sorry.
Hi. When I was in college, I took Arab-Israeli conflict back in the olden days in the mid-1980s, but we were taught facts, and it went all the way back to the 1800s. I'm concerned about hearing, and have, as a political science major who studied a lot of history, I've been concerned about agenda-based teaching. I'm hearing you talk a lot about the University of Memphis, which is the other U of M. I went to University of Michigan, but a lot of agenda-based teaching. I'm also concerned about this generation of student who thinks that history began on October 8th. And I wanted to see, you've talked a little bit about this, but I wanted you, if you could comment a little bit more about both of those.
Well, I think especially right now, because there is an attack on academic freedom, there are bills that have passed through the Tennessee state legislature about divisive concepts. This whole thing that Trump has about sanitizing history, none of it is conducive to allowing free speech and for experts to speak freely about what has happened in the past. And so I think we're in a pretty dangerous situation in that sense, just in terms of even American history, let alone world history, or Middle Eastern history. But I think for my students, because they sign up for my class, they are interested in, the century and a half before October 8th, 2023. The class I'm teaching right now on the Ottoman Empire, which goes from 1299 to 1922, it's got 28 students in it, and the class is capped at 30 students. So there's an interest out there. I just think the students who are oblivious or uninterested in what actually happened in the past can get away with it because our government isn't really interested in supporting the humanities, and they really should be. Because if you actually had, I think Memphis does a pretty good job through Facing History and ourselves, because they work with high schools. So they're getting to students who may never end up at the University of Memphis or some other college. But with the kinds of legislation that's passed in this state and in a couple of other states, and with the current U.S. president not interested in teaching history, I think it's a really dangerous place that we're in, and it's not going to go in a good direction until the legislation changes.
I want to add on one more thing, specifically about the way that our young people are learning history outside of the college lecture hall, right? And it's no secret that social media and influencers and the way that many of our teens specifically, but college students and young adults absorb news is in tidbits, right? It's like small sound bites that leave a lot out of context, right? That is only in, a specific algorithm that doesn't give the full factual story. And much of that, especially in this Israel space, really I don't know the best way to put it, but it really flourished in a lot of ways, or the field of it really flourished during October 8th and beyond, right? You've got many, many people who started making a living as an influencer talking about Israel and interpreting the news about Israel. And that's the way that so many of our young people are receiving and learning that, whether it be a pro-Israel or an anti-Zionist stance, right? It exists in both. And some of them are really, really high quality, but regardless of how high quality it is, when you are only learning your news in a 30-second soundbite, there's going to be stuff missing, right? You're never going to have all the facts. You're never going to have all of the context. So I think that's another element, that it's both what's happening inside of classrooms and inside of coursework, but it's also what we're seeing in our daily lives.
And I think that's a really excellent point. One of the things that connects to stuff like TikTok and photos that go online and video clips is that there's a lot of altered realities that come up through that, like AI photos that have been, and so some of them do end up with those little red bars around it that says AI generated, but some of them don't. So I think it's really an important space to encourage younger people to be more media literate, so they recognize when something is suspicious. And if something feels too perfectly aligned with how you want to feel, that's a good place to maybe dig a little deeper and see more on every position. Because there's always more than two sides. There's like 100 sides when you're talking about Israel and Palestine.
I know
Let's
that
take one more question.
You were waiting a long time.
I'm sorry. My name's Ellen. I would like to come back to trauma of 7 October. In relation to European and American Jews. And my question to you here is, do you feel that many of us have to justify being Jewish and have to justify what happens in the Middle East? Oh, you're Jewish. Oh, Gaza. And hop, there they go again. What is your answer to that?
I think it's sad that we have to justify wanting Israel to exist. I wish it wasn't something we had to justify. I do think that when people jump to the conclusion that because someone's Jewish that they are directly implicated in Israeli war crimes, that is a good time to disengage from that person, because I don't think they're ready to hear you point out how wrong they are. But I think for our own self-preservation, it's not really great for our own mental health to constantly be explaining our right to be a group of people and to support Israel as a state that's supposed to be a safe place. I do think it can be an opportunity for people, whether they're Jewish or Muslim or Christian or Baha'i or Zoroastrian or Hindu, or Buddhist. You have an opportunity to engage with people from different backgrounds about their own faith, and we all have the right to question ourselves. And you can ask somebody innocently and in good faith, what groups do you support? What do you see as a just society? And you can build from there. I mean, the idea that Israel is built on this kind of inherent tension of it's meant to be a democratic state, but it's also meant to be a safe place for Jews. So how is that supposed to look? And that's something that Israelis have never agreed on, let alone American Jews. So I think it is sad that we have to justify that we have a right to be Jewish, but I think when people automatically conflate a person's religious background with a particular political persuasion, that's very dangerous. Not all, Christians are, extremist Republicans or something. Not Republicans, sorry, extremists.
So bringing it back to Yom Kippur as we close, the idea that we are, or I guess, are we able, or how are we able to hold empathy for Israelis and Palestinians while holding to our own communal healing at the same time, and specifically holding empathy for Palestinians when in a way it's so often not reciprocated, right? That the anti-Semitism level being so high, and yet there's this tension of saying, you know, we want to have empathy for whoever we want to have empathy for, and, you know, people that are suffering, and, you know, children that are suffering, and all of the above. But also, none of that empathy is being reciprocated by so much of the public, right?
Yeah, so that's a really hard space for us to get into, because it's absolutely we should. No, yeah, okay, sorry. I'm a historian, so I'll be up here for 2 hours. No, but I think one of the things that is a great opportunity for us is that there already have been, I think there was over 100 rabbis that signed off on something that was declaring what was happening in Gaza like unjust. And they were from, you know, the U.S., Canada, and Israel, and other places. So I think we can. I wrote something about it's like an analogy to physical wounds. Like, let's say you're in you know, martial combat, and you've got a cut, and you're going to keep going. You still need to dress the wound, even in the midst of the battle. So there's something, you can't wait for it to be over to address the trauma that's behind it. You need to kind of care for yourself and help others care for themselves. And I think even just making it known in whatever circles you're in that you are against senseless killing, but you are proud to be Jewish, and you shouldn't feel scared to be Jewish. And if you say that in front of enough people, you'll get to say it in front of some anti-Semites, and they might get uncomfortable, and that's important, that they get that place of empathic unsettlement. Like, they need to recognize in themselves that they're anti-Semites, and they need to find a way to, and the problem is that the current government is not really interested in silencing people who are very bigoted. And so that's, you know, there are white supremacists and anti-Semites in certain sections of government right now. So it's not an easy, you know, path for us to be on. But I think even if you can't reach out specifically to, you know, an entire population of, you know, Palestinians who are not interested in hearing about Israel's right to exist, you can still find a space. I am able to find a space in my classrooms easily, because it's what I teach, but like where you can talk about people having the right to have their own religious beliefs, and that does not dictate what should happen to another community. Like, you shouldn't eliminate an entire group based on their religious beliefs or their ethnicity, because that is ethnic cleansing. So, but yeah, does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. So a lot to think about. We are at about time, but thank you for being here. Again, there's, like you said, there's probably 200 different opinions and views in this room, and 200 different, you know, expertises in different areas of knowledge and of profession and of study. But thank you for sharing yours with us. And next up, Ruach Music Hour starts in about 10 minutes, and Torah study also starts in about 10 minutes.